I am going to give you, wherever you are right now, an invitation to make a decision. This invitation, I want to be clear, is for everybody, whether you've grown up in church or this is your first time to ever even watch a church service. This invitation is for people who, if you're honest, you don't really relate to what you've seen or heard so far. This invitation is for people who may feel far from God right now because of your past, or maybe your present. It's an invitation for people who may have felt close to God at some point in your life, but that was a long time ago and a lot has happened since then. Doesn't matter your past, your present, your personality, your politics, your age, your ethnicity. This invitation is for you a few moments from now, right where you are sitting. This invitation is for you to begin or renew a relationship with Jesus. I'm going to invite you to make that decision. But before I invite you to make that decision, I want to ask you a question. We're all being reminded every day of how vulnerable and frail each of our lives really is. So that leads to the question I want to ask. So here's the question. Do you know for certain, like, are you 100% confident that if you were to contract this virus and die from it, do you know beyond the shadow of a doubt that you would go to heaven for all of eternity? And most people, when I ask that question, they either say to me, I don't know, sure if I would go to heaven, or I think I would, or I hope I would. They say, I'm a pretty good person, I've not done too many bad things, maybe I've gone to church. But did you know that God says none of those things actually gets anyone to heaven? None of them. God says there is only one way you can know you will go to heaven when you die. And I want to show it to you now. Mark chapter 5, verse 21 says, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. So this crowd was gathering around Jesus because they knew he had power to heal the sick. Many people had been healed of their diseases by Jesus. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And we see that verse and we see this reference to the rulers of the synagogue. We need to realize these were some of the most revered and respected people in society in that day. So picture a man very well liked and highly respected by the crowd. So he comes up to Jesus, and seeing him, he fell at his feet. Now that would have been shocking because the religious elite at this point were not a fan of Jesus. So for this respected religious leader to come up and fall at Jesus' feet just took everybody's breath away in the crowd. They just got really quiet. And he implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Now we find out later this is Jairus' only daughter. She's 12 years old, and he says she's dying. So that's why he implored him earnestly. In other words, he begged Jesus, please come as quickly as you can, pleading before the only person who is your daughter's only hope. Jairus says to Jesus, come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Do you hear that confidence? And Jairus says, if you will just come touch her, she will live. This is a profound picture of faith, but it's about to get even more intense. Verse 24 says, and he went with him. The problem is there's a crowd in the way. Verse 24 says, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. There was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Basically, this woman has been sick as long as Jairus' daughter has been alive, and who had suffered much under many physicians, had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, even if I touch his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned around about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Now, at this point, if you're Jairus, you're thinking, why are you stopping and turning around? Why are you asking such a ridiculous question? Because tons of people are touching you. It's exactly what the disciples asked too. His disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. Again, picture Jairus' daughter dying and Jairus sweating, thinking, come on, this is no time for small talk. And everybody else in the crowd is thinking the same thing, how urgent his daughter's situation is. Meanwhile, the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Now, that was a powerful moment for this woman. This was a painful moment for Jairus. While Jesus was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead." Think about the emotions in Jairus' mind, on Jairus' face in this moment as his jaw drops and his eyes fill with tears, and he looks over toward Jesus and this random woman. The people say to Jairus, "Why trouble the teacher any further?" In other words, it's too late. There's nothing Jesus can do now. But the first clue we have in the story that death is not the end of the story, but overhearing what they said, and the word there for overhearing could be translated ignoring. It's a great word, like overhearing, ignoring, disregarding what they said about the death of Jairus' daughter. Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Jairus, you have two options. One option is fear, which I am going to define here as trust in this world. Trust in this world. Trust in what they are telling you, that it's over. And as long as you trust in this world, it will ultimately lead to fear. We can't trust in our health, even in our best medicine. We can't trust in our jobs. We can't trust in our economy. These are ultimately unsure foundations that only lead to fear. So that's one option, Jesus says. The other option is faith, belief, which I'm going to define here as trust in Jesus. And at this point, Jesus has never raised someone from the dead. Nobody ever seen or even imagined that. That was preposterous, unthinkable, unimaginable, beyond the realm of possibility. Faith against all odds is trust in Jesus. Jesus takes you by the arm and begins to walk with you to your home. It's exactly what Jesus did. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. By the time they finally made it back to Jairus' home, the mourning process was in full motion. Verse 38 says, they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Into this scene, Jesus entered, and he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Now, what's interesting about this word sleeping is that it's used in other places in the Bible to describe death, like real death. The reality is Jairus' daughter has died. Jesus knew that. Jairus knew that. Jairus' family knew that. These mourners knew that. There was no doubt. But the connotation of this word that Jesus uses is obviously different. It's like Jesus understood death differently. Like death, though real, is not the end. So, what did the people at Jairus' house do? Verse 40 says they laughed at him. And the word for laugh is basically to deride him with disdain. They mocked him. Much like, by the way, many right now mock any mention of God. But Jesus put them all outside. The language literally is he told him to get out, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, so that's Peter, James, and John, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha Kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." One verb, one imperative of command. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And they are staring at her with amazement, as are Peter and James and John. Everybody but Jesus is shocked. He just took someone who was dead, not just sick, not just in a coma, not just looking dead, but dead, and Jesus gave her life. Watch this with me. Listen to the last sentence in the story. And Jesus strictly charged them that no one should know this. He told them to give her something to eat. Like, okay, I get the second part. It's a girl who's been sick. She needs nourishment. It's actually a powerful picture of Jesus' personal compassion to say, feed her, care for her. But the first part, Jesus strictly charged them that no one should know this. Like, nobody, don't tell anybody about this. Like, why not? The answer to that question is the key to understanding this story. Jesus knew that something else was needed. Something greater than healing people of diseases, and something greater than even bringing someone back from death. Because the reality is that woman earlier who was healed of her disease, one day she would get sick again, and one day she would die. And this precious little girl, now walking around her house, one day, maybe decades from that day, one day she would also die. We need something greater than a cure to a disease that will keep us from death. Because even if we have a cure for COVID-19 and every other virus, the reality is you and I are still one day going to die. You are going to die. Doesn't matter how healthy we are, at some point all of our bodies are going to wear out. This is all of us, the most educated and the least educated, the richest and the poorest, black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, African. We're all going to either get sick and die one day or experience a sudden death one day. And it could be any day for any of us. It's just reality. And Jesus knew that. And Jesus knew the reason for that. So why is this? Why do we have sickness and disease and suffering and death in this world? Why do our bodies waste away? There's a reason for this. It all goes back to the entrance of sin into this world. God created the world and you and me to enjoy Him, to enjoy each other, to enjoy the world in perfect harmony. But we turn from God to ourselves. Every one of us has chosen to trust ourselves over God. That's the story of every one of our lives. It looks different in our different lives, but the core story is the same. The Bible calls this sin in our hearts, and our sin separates us from God and ruins the harmony that God designed for us with Him, with each other, and in the world. That's why we have sorrow and sickness and coronaviruses and disease and death in this world, because we are separated from God. And if you or I die in this state of separation from God, we will spend eternity in suffering away from God. And Jesus, knowing this, came to do the unimaginable, the unthinkable, that which was beyond the realm of possibility in our minds. Jesus came not just to heal many people of their diseases, as awesome as that is, and He came not just to bring a couple of people back from the dead, as amazing as that is, but this is why Jesus said, don't tell anybody about this, because they'll think that's the point of my coming, when the point of my coming is so much greater than this. Like the point of my coming, Jesus is saying, is to take on the root of sickness and the root of disease and the root of suffering and the root of death. I came to take on sin itself. And this is what Easter is all about. Jesus lived a life with no sin in Him, which means He did not have to die, but He chose to die to pay the price for our sin. Jesus died to pay the price for your sin and my sin. Jesus died on the cross for us, but His death was not the end of His story. 3 days later, Jesus rose from the grave, and this is the greatest news in all the world. Sin, the root of all sickness, the root of all disease, the root of all suffering, has been severed, and death has been defeated. And eternal life is now available to anyone, everyone, anywhere, everywhere who believes in Jesus. So come back to this word, believe. Come back to this call to faith. Faith is trust in Jesus. And that is the only way you can know you have eternal life in heaven. Not by trust in this world or trust in yourself. Not by trust in how good you are, how moral you are, how kind you are, how much you've gone to church. Doesn't matter. You're a sinner separated from God in this world, and you cannot solve that problem on your own. You must trust in Jesus for life. To trust Jesus with your life now, and to trust Jesus with your life forever. Believe. You say, I'll do this later, but I want to warn you, there may not be a later. I cannot say this more plainly. You are not guaranteed tomorrow. I'm not either. You or I could die at any moment, and this opportunity will be gone forever. Even if you live for many more years, you don't want to harden your heart toward God right now. To hear the voice of God's Spirit speaking to you like He is today, and you say, maybe later, and God lets your heart harden all the more, and you never come back to this moment. I say to some of you, this could be your last opportunity. Today is the day. Don't make excuses. Today's excuses will be tomorrow's regrets. 5 minutes into eternity, what are you going to be glad that you held on to that kept you from Jesus? I want to invite you to decide right now to put your trust in Jesus.